Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a history that is, frankly, vast, complex, and incredibly sobering. We're going to map out the staggering scale and the shocking, highly localized reality of the Nazi forced labor system. By digging into newly digitized historical archives and meticulously cataloged records, we're going to trace this entire architecture of exploitation. We'll start way up at the macro level, looking at literally millions of deported individuals, and then we're going to zoom all the way down into the microcamps hidden right inside ordinary, everyday villages. It's a vital history to uncover, and together, we're going to trace exactly how this horrific system functioned.
Let's kick things off with a statistic that just stops you in your tracks. 2.1 million. According to newly released background info in the Arrels and Archives e-guide, this represents the number of Soviet civilian forced laborers inside the German Reich in a single month. August 1944. Just pause and really think about that scale for a second. We aren't talking about military prisoners here. These were millions of everyday civilians completely uprooted from their lives. And wait, the scale only compounds from there. In that exact same month, August 1944, you have to add another 1.6 million Polish civilian laborers to that total. Now, the archives reveal that in the early years of the war, German employment offices used false promises to lure in some volunteers, promising better living and working conditions. But as those volunteers quickly dried up, the regime shifted gears entirely. They turned to sheer brutal coercion, resulting in the mass deportation of millions from Central and Eastern Europe. All right, let's move into Section 1, the scale of forced labor and how millions were deported. So you might be wondering, how on earth did a regime actually manage the logistics of relocating and enslaving nearly 4 million civilians from just two nations? Well, the answer lies in the paperwork. This wasn't just chaos. It was a cold, highly organized bureaucracy of coercion. The Arrels and Archives digital e-guide really helps us decode this dark administration. Every single person deported to do forced labor was meticulously cataloged. They were tracked through residence registration cards and cross-referenced using index cards from the foreigner police. The regime literally built a massive paper trail to ensure absolute, total control over the millions of individuals they had displaced. Moving right along to Section 2, the Gusen Industrial Complex and Industrial Exploitation. To really wrap our heads around a place like Gusen, we first have to understand the corporate machinery behind it. Enter DEST, the German Earth and Stoneworks Company. Now, this was not your standard business. It was actually founded by the SS leadership back in April 1938. Their explicit goal? To produce building materials by ruthlessly exploiting concentration camp prisoners. At places like the Gusen and Mauthausen granite quarries, the SS essentially created a corporate shell to legitimize working human beings to death. At the Gusen quarries, forced labor and extermination weren't just linked, they were the exact same thing. Prisoners were subjected to back-breaking penal labor for up to 13 hours a day under entirely inhumane conditions. And the historical records point out a really dark paradox here. The deliberate wastage of human life was actually at odds with the SS's own economic interests. They had a permanent lock of skilled workers, yet they continuously and systematically worked countless prisoners until they died. But here's a really crucial takeaway. This wasn't just limited to SS-run companies. No way. By 1943, some major corporate players became deeply complicit. Two massive arms companies, Steyr Daimler-Puch and Messerschmitt, moved parts of their production directly into the Mauthausen and Gusen concentration camps. They exploited thousands of these prisoners to manufacture weapons and airplane parts, weaving corporate enterprise directly into the fabric of the camp's terror. As the war dragged on and Allied air raids really started ramping up, the situation grew even more dire. Starting in late 1943, this terrifying underground shift began. Prisoners were forced to dig several kilometers of tunnels by hand, straight into the rock, just to hide and protect this corporate arms production. This grueling, subterranean forced labor was incredibly dangerous and resulted in exceptionally high death rates among the prisoners. That brings us to Section 3. We're zooming in now to look at terror in the countryside, microcamps hidden in ordinary towns. A lot of this rural terror was tied to the construction of the Südostwall, or Southeast Wall. This was a late-war defensive line built to hold off the advancing Soviet army. To build it, the Nazi regime required immense manpower, so they dispersed thousands of forced laborers, specifically Hungarian Jewish prisoners, into everyday rural communities across regions like the Austrian Burgenland. And here's the thing, they didn't build massive new camps for them. They just used whatever buildings were already there in the villages. What is truly chilling about this phase of the war is just the sheer banality of it all. According to the Austrian Federal Monuments Office catalog, in Grieselstein, they used the local primary school. In Rechnitz, a former synagogue and a castle. In Lutzmannsburg, a local brickyard. In Ogau, they literally just used ordinary street addresses, Antonigasse 2, 4, and 6. This perfectly illustrates how the horror of forced labor wasn't kept out of sight. It was integrated right next door to ordinary citizens, right into the mundane infrastructure of small-town life. Let's zoom in on one specific example to really ground this. Schondorf 86. Sounds like a totally normal street address, right? It was just an ordinary, multi-part house on a long plot right in the center of the village. But according to the archives, it was transformed into a lazaret, a makeshift hospital for these Hungarian Jewish forced laborers. Hundreds of prisoners were held in the town, suffering from exhaustion and terrifying outbreaks of typhus, crammed into residential properties exactly like this one.
Now, we need to be absolutely clear about something. Just because these camps were small and tucked away in quiet rural towns did not mean they were any less violent. These improvised microcamps became the sites of horrific micro-massacres. The catalog records that in places like Deutschschützen and Neuhaus am Klausenbach, dozens of exhausted or sick prisoners were flat-out murdered. In Neuhaus alone, a single massacre on March 23, 1945, left 83 people dead. The brutality of the system reached absolutely every corner of the countryside.
Okay, let's head into our fourth and final section, preserving the hidden truth and cataloging this history. Because so many of these sites were just temporary setups, a school, a local barn, an inn, they are incredibly easy to just forget or pave right over. Today, the Austrian Federal Monuments Office is undertaking the massive task of geographically and historically cataloging these local Holocaust sites. They're actually mapping exact property parcels, recording the GPS coordinates of a parish barn or a local brickyard. It's all to ensure that the physical footprint of this terror is documented and preserved for future generations. And alongside mapping the actual physical geography, we've got organizations tirelessly mapping the paper trail. The Erlsen Archives, which we talked about earlier, holds the world's most comprehensive archive on the victims of National Socialism. They're actively digitizing the very residents' registration cards and police index files that the Nazis used to track these millions of civilian forced laborers.
So what does this all mean for us today? Well, they've built this amazing interactive e-guide that essentially lets these cold, bureaucratic documents finally speak. It breaks down the whole complex system of civilian forced labor. And brilliantly, they aren't just keeping this in one language. They're translating these records and explanatory notes into Polish, English, German, Russian, and French. By shattering these language barriers, they're giving millions of families from Central and Eastern Europe direct access to the truth about what happened to their relatives. We're going to wrap up today's explainer with a question for you to really chew on. How much of our own everyday landscape holds hidden histories of the past? When we see how easily a local primary school or just a neighborhood house could be transformed into a site of profound suffering, it completely changes how we view the world around us, doesn't it? It underscores exactly why the meticulous preservation work by the Erlsen Archives and the Federal Monuments Office is so critically important today. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this history. I really hope it gave you a deeper understanding of both the massive scale and the intimate local reality of forced labor.